So like all good military men, I've got a mission this afternoon, and my mission is to speak to you for about 40 minutes on the issue of being a Christian in conflict. And to do that, I've decided to use a doctrine from within the British Army, which is called the moral component of fighting power. And I'll initially explain that from a military perspective, and then broaden it out, develop it from a broader societal, cultural context. So to manage your expectations, this is my favorite military quote. H.G. Wells, reputed to have said that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man of high intellectual ability would willingly imprison his calling in such, his gifts in such a calling. Well, that's me. I don't know whether there's anybody else from the military environment here today. But that said, apparently H.G. Wells met Stalin once and left thinking Stalin was a nice bloke. So perhaps I haven't got to worry too much. And as Robert Louis Stevenson once said, God give me the man who has the brains to make a fool of himself, which I've always been prepared to do. So here goes. I joined the army as a cadet, as you heard, when I was actually 13, just 20 years after D-Day in 1964. And after spending 2 years at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, was commissioned in 1971. Did 4 tours in Germany, in West Germany during the 70s and 80s, as a part of the British Army of the Rhine, facing what was called at the time 3 Shock Army, part of the Russian-led Warsaw Pact forces in the Cold War. The 1970s included a year in Northern Ireland on anti-terrorist operations, and a year in Cyprus on a peacekeeping operation with the United Nations. And it was as a result of being in Cyprus and going to Jerusalem that I became a Christian, having visited the Garden Tomb, for those of you who know it. The end of the Cold War was followed by a war-fighting operation to get Iraq out of Kuwait, and 3 peace enforcement operations in the Balkans. And finally, 12 years after the first Gulf War, there was, of course, the invasion of Iraq, which has been referred to. I deployed to Baghdad in 2003, having been involved in briefing people like the Prime Minister and others about this Phase 4 post-war operation, and arrived as the insurgency and the civil war broke out. And then after returning to the UK, I subsequently took command of one of the 3 divisions of the UK Field Army, my final appointment. It wasn't actually command of all the troops in Iraq. The headquarters was based back here, although I had people in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, over those years, I experienced at first hand the reality of conflict and the religious, ethnic, and cultural bigotry that divides our world and the violence that flows from it, including watching mass graves being dug up. Trying to understand the bitterness between and amongst religions and what lay behind the various brutal secular and/or atheistic regimes, I came to the conclusion that words like sin and evil were not interesting theological words. They are a reality of a broken and fallen world. And if we are to deter war and defend peace, we need to be capable of standing firm against them. Which is why the principal role of an army, the reason it exists, is to deliver fighting power. Everything is directed towards this end. Our professional competence is measured in adversarial terms. The test is war and battle. The measure is triumph or defeat. And this fighting power is made up of 3 components. The first is the physical component. It's the stuff, the means to fight. Having the latest and best equipment, weapons, armored vehicles, helicopters, and so on, is pretty obviously crucial to winning. The second is the conceptual component, the thought process behind the ability to fight, how to operate on the battlefield, get the best out of the equipment, how best to maneuver in order to defeat the enemy. Now, for many, that might be it, but the ability to achieve success on any operation is much more than just equipment or an intellectual understanding of how best to employ it. Don't misunderstand me. Without those 2, no army will win or even survive for long on the battlefield. But no amount of either will guarantee success. which is why we have formally in our doctrine, embedded in our doctrine, a third component of fighting power, and it's called the moral component. War is before anything else a matter of psychology. Operations are characterized by uncertainty, by fear, fatigue, and discomfort, and by their very nature, they are dangerous, physically and mentally demanding, and extremely unpredictable, all of which must be faced and overcome if we are to get our soldiers to fight well, and if necessary, to die for the cause. It was Napoleon who said that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. And any analysis of military history shows that a military with a strong moral component can hold firm against apparently impossible odds, which is, of course, exactly what we're seeing in Ukraine today. So what is it that gets a soldier out on patrol in places of conflict, knowing there's a good chance that they could well be wounded, injured, or killed? The answer to that question includes these 3 things: effective leadership and management, the motivation to achieve the task, and an ethical base and a moral cohesion. And the last one, of course, is important in the context of today. All difficult to define or calculate, these are underpinned by words like duty and selfless commitment, trust, honor, integrity, courage, particularly moral courage, and discipline, love, loyalty, friendship, and sacrifice. These are the virtues, to use Nigel's comment this morning. Unlike mere numbers, there is a spiritual dimension here. What separates out the good army from the brutal is a determination to adhere to certain codes of behavior, along with maintaining a sense of justice and righteousness. Field Marshal Bill Slim, perhaps the greatest British commander in World War II, wrote in his book, Defeat into Victory, these words: "Morale has a spiritual as much as an intellectual or material base, as much as a conceptual or physical component." And Field Marshal Montgomery argued well over 60 years ago that he did not believe that a commander could inspire great armies or single units or even individual men unless he has a proper sense of religious truth. All leadership, he argued, is based on the spiritual quality, the power to inspire others to follow. So a moral component, decisive in conflict, is my reference point. To see what that looks like in a broader society, I'm going to borrow some analysis from that great man, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, sadly, of course, now dead. Imagine you are taking your family, particularly a younger member of your family, to London for the first day. They've never been there before, and you're going to take them for a day out. I don't know about you, but I come into London at Waterloo Station, and very close by is the Millennium Wheel. So you decide to take your child with you onto the Millennium Wheel. And as the Millennium Wheel, the pod takes off, the flight begins. When you get to about 3 o'clock on the clock face, the child says to you, "What's out there? What are these buildings that I can see on the other side of the river?" So you point to the House of Parliament, or Parliament, the House of Commons and Lords, and you explain to the child about politics, political goods, how politics is produced and distributed. And the child, because they're your son, grandson, daughter, granddaughter, asks you some pretty challenging questions. And by now the pod is at 12 o'clock on the clock face, and they finish that. So you sweep your arm majestically to the right-hand side, you point to the City of London, and you explain to the child about economic power, how wealth is generated and distributed. The child asks you some smart questions. The clock face is now, or the pod is now at 9 o'clock on the clock face. You're coming into land. You think you've got off to a great start to the day. And the child tugs you by the arm, points to St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey, and says to you, "What are those places for? What do they produce? What do they distribute?" And Jonathan simply says, "How do you answer?" The child. The world of nation states is largely, of course, focused on the first two, which on the face of it are all that is needed to run a successful society: the state and the economy, the government and the market, political and economic goods. Politics is about society as a collective body, and we, the citizens, agree to abide by the law, recognizing it is in our collective and individual interest to do so. The market is about society made up of private individuals who are free to choose to do what they like within the framework of that law, to buy and sell to anyone willing to buy from or sell to. That's the essence of it. Political power mediated through government, law, politics, and the courts. Economic power mediated by money and markets. And societies of any shade or colour around the world have produced the execution of these two over the centuries in different ways, usually arguing that any problem can be solved by one or the other. They are perhaps the equivalent of the physical and conceptual component of a society. But I would argue there's a problem. Like fighting power, what these leave out are some exceptionally important things, like love and loyalty and friendship and trust and commitment and fidelity and integrity and honour and duty. Virtues that, again, as Nigel said, words we don't hear much about, so much anyway, in today's world. For the sake of simplicity, let's call these things moral goods. And what's interesting about these goods is you can't take account of them in terms of politics or economics, the state or the individual, the law or the market. Take friendship, for example. Amidst the current political crisis and chaos, the government might be tempted to announce a new law saying that we are all to be friends with one another, which would clearly be nonsense. If somebody helps me because there's a law that says they must do so, then they are clearly not helping me as a friend. Recognizing that, I have in my wallet sufficient cash to ensure that I can slip you all a £5 as you leave the room later on this afternoon, in the hope that you will become my friend. I said this recently at a conference, and a voice at the back said, "Make it 20 quid and you might be in with a chance." But again, we know this is nonsense. You can't buy true friendship. If we try to analyze friendship in terms of the state or the market, it doesn't work. Friendship is about something deeper. It can't be explained in terms of the law on the one hand, or exchange on the other. But friendship is important to us, isn't it? Individually and collectively. In the military, it is a vital part of the moral component. Soldiers don't principally fight for king and country. They fight and die for their mates. They sacrifice themselves for their friends. In the fusion of friendship, soldiers discover strength and power they could never otherwise discover. And we see this played out in spades on a battlefield. And hopefully, you see something of it in your day-to-day lives as well. And there is one crucial difference between political and economic goods on the one hand and moral goods on the other. Suppose you have total political power, but you must then share it with others, as in a coalition. Do you have more or less power than you started with? Or suppose I open my wallet and divide it with you all. Do I end up with more or less money than I started with? The state, which deals with power, and the markets, which deal with wealth, are essentially zero-sum games. The more I share, the less I have. Now think of my moral goods. If I share these with other people, do I have more or less? Moral goods are the things of which the more I give away, the more I have. The more I share, the more I possess. Friendship, love, trust, integrity, and so on, only exist in virtue of being shared. and exercised. And they are the key differentiators between a good or great military, or indeed society, and a poor, ordinary, or brutal one. And it is from them that we find the ability to dig deep, to go the extra mile, carry the extra burden, to press on in the face of hardship, to find the inner strength and moral courage that enables us to carry the day, to stand firm on a battlefield, to hold the line in business, to fight for justice and righteousness in a community or a nation. In putting together his best-selling book, Good to Great, Jim Collins, everybody heard of his book, a fantastic read. Jim Collins and his team looked at companies which had made the transition from just being good organizations to becoming great ones. And they subsequently looked at how these great organizations often stumble and fall, how the mighty fall. Analyzing the data, the biggest lesson that Collins learned was this was not about circumstances. It was largely a matter of choice and discipline. I've only time to highlight two of the headlines, gleaned, I stress, from the data gathered by hardened business analysts. First, the leaders of great organizations are ambitious, first and foremost, for the cause, not for themselves. Interesting in the context of Fiona's comment earlier. They are people-focused, displaying a blend of personal humility and professional will. This humility is not softness, but a deep desire to serve the people, to serve the company. It's not about me, the leader, it's about those I am leading, which is why it's not by chance that the hat badge of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst says serve to lead. And of course, we all know who the greatest servant leader was, still is. Secondly, these organizations and their leaders adhere to core values. They display a willingness to challenge and change everything except those core values. They keep a clear distinction between what we stand for and how we do things, which never stops changing. Establishing and holding firm to enduring principles, they constantly adapt the practice to meet the changing environment, but never compromise the core values. Businesses and societies always suffer when selfishness and greed rule the roost. But when they are needed, integrity, moral courage, and so forth don't just materialize like magic, emerging through wishful thinking when the going gets tough. Moral goods need to be embedded in any organization, inculcated and lived day by day by the individuals who operate within them. And those individuals need to possess another quality, another virtue. Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, wrote a great book called The Anatomy of Courage. And in it he said this: a man of character in peace is a man of courage in war. He contended that fortitude in war has its roots in morality, and that selection is a search for character, and that war itself is but one more test, supreme and final test, if you will. And a previous Bishop of Durham, in a lecture at St Andrews University in 1934, said, as you can see, the safety of Britain depends not on her wealth and administration, but on the character of her people. This in turn depends on the institutions that form character. Now, like the moral component, character is difficult to define. It's deeper and different from concepts like charisma or personality or image or good looks. It makes anyone or anything what it is, whether that is people or wine or a period in history. It's a moral quality which grows to maturity and peace and is not suddenly developed at the outbreak of war or on the outset of a major problem in work or in the nation. It can't be legislated for or bought. As Aristotle taught, it is a habit, the daily choice of right instead of wrong. It's who we are and what we get up to in the dark when we don't think anybody's watching. Our fate in life's battles is worked out long before the wars begin, which is why General Norman Schwarzkopf, who commanded the coalition in the First Gulf War, famously said, "Leadership is a potent combination of strategy and character. But if you must be without one of them, be without strategy." Now perhaps we can begin to answer the child's question. These other buildings, Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, and every other place of worship up and down the land, provide the moral component of our society. They produce and distribute the moral goods of our society. Not goods resulting from politics and economics, but framing and underpinning them, and underpinning a society's individual and corporate character. So what does all of this tell us about our society today? How strong is our moral component in our nation, the character of our civilization? Now, we need to be careful here. When being challenged in a media interview, often I'm asked about some failing or other in the British Army. And I usually remind the interviewer that the Army is a deeply flawed organization because it's made up of people like me. And his or her organization is also deeply flawed. We are all deeply flawed. We're all part of the problem. We all, as Christians, know the truth of that. And we do need to recognize both that reality and also that there is much about our nation and our society today that should be applauded. But, and I think it's a big but, the simple truth is that we have increasingly turned on our backs on our biblical heritage. And it seems to me that we are paying a price for doing so. Just about everywhere we look today, we see character in terminal decline, being replaced by a personality-driven celebrity culture applauded by a complicit media. Not long before his untimely death, Jonathan Sacks wrote that in a time of increasing individualism, we are abandoning a we and us world for a I and me world. A world in which it is less and less easy for people to see the need to move beyond the self, to move beyond the iPod, the iPlayer, the iPhone, and the selfie. Harsh exchanges over the echo chamber of the internet and social media have replaced civil conversations and discussions. We know that increasingly people just don't listen to one another. The result is that we are a weakened society, a fragmented nation uncoupled from its formative traditions and without a unifying vision for the future. As Os Guinness says in his great little book on truth, we are living in a world of lies, hype, and spin, moving values that are dictated by circumstances and emotions, not by eternal perspectives with little or no objective truth. And Nigel spoke about that earlier. As someone once said to me, truth is true even if nobody believes it, just as lies are lies even if everyone believes them. A previous White House Chief of Staff, Mort Sahl, famously remarked, "George Washington couldn't tell a lie. Richard Nixon couldn't tell the truth. Bill Clinton didn't know the difference." Moral goods are not things that can be toyed with and discarded lightly. Living in what many are now calling a cut flower society, with a loss of identity and purpose, we have cut ourselves off from our spiritual soil. And like flowers put in a vase, things may look fine for a while, but the brutal reality is that those cut flowers will end up in the brown bin in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And moral goods pushed aside or ignored and left to rot will fade and die. 60 years ago, there was a generation which largely had a Bible in the house and often read it or heard it read in a church. The generation that followed may have had a Bible somewhere, but they rarely have ever read it, but occasionally heard it read in church. Today we have a generation that neither has one nearby, nor have they read it, or nor do they hear it read. And there is a price to pay. It doesn't take long for people to start to believe and inhabit quite different views of humanity when they lose touch with the soil from which they grew. Secularism is often portrayed as a neutral, non-faith position. But although secularists and others don't like much the idea, I think everyone is a person of faith. We all see the world through the prism of our beliefs, and we make our choices on the basis of those beliefs, our moral choices. That prism may be religious, but often in today's world it isn't. It's an atheistic, humanism, agnostic, whatever prism. But the outcomes are not the same. Many people, including people like Professor Dawkins, consider themselves cultural Christians. Apart from displaying a certain level of cultural free riding, they also display an almost touching naivety that by abandoning Christianity, we would somehow embrace a sort of enlightened secular position, a values-neutral space rooted in reason. And that is clearly not the case. My grandmother used to call such people intellectual idiots, educated well beyond their intelligence. It doesn't take the brains of an evolutionary biologist to work out that secularism is seriously mistaken in its diagnosis. Secularism provides a maximum of choice, but a minimum of meaning. And it's hard to live life without meaning. And we don't need to look far to see what happens when secular or atheistic regimes are established. The promised rational world does not materialize. A nastier one supplants what was there before. The ideas of human dignity, human rights, and equality may be seen by many as values that they can hold on to without Judeo-Christianity, without the soil, the biblical soil, but we can't. Between them, Napoleon's France, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Mao's China, Kim's North Korea, represent a crude mix of nationalism, social Darwinism, and bastardized paganism. They are, in effect, the archetypal idolatrous secular societies, and what flowed and still flows from them today reflects a ruthless self-belief alongside an equally ruthless violence and oppression. Believing in secular relativism means an absolute disregard for life. And to say that such murderous totalitarianism has nothing to do with today's atheistic and secular society here in the UK and elsewhere is to completely misunderstand both them and the ideologies on which their actions rested. And that those who declare that they no longer need a Bible and that they don't need any higher power to tell them the right way to behave, but that they simply need to be true to themselves, a rather childish mantra, oft repeated, seem to forget that Hitler, Stalin, and all the rest were presumably being true to themselves as they committed genocide against their own and other peoples. When I was in Iraq in 2003, I visited Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon, south of Baghdad, and further north, the place where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were supposedly thrown into the fiery furnace for refusing to bow down to a false god. Like Saddam 3,000 years or so later, this was a brutal regime, and like every other such regime before and since, the Babylonian civilization crashed, and burned. In the 1870s, Nietzsche wrote a series of books attacking the values of Judaism and Christianity. His argument was simple. He said that what was natural to human beings was the will to power. All that mattered was political and economic power. He argued that Judaism and Christianity were unnatural in putting right above might, compassion above ruthlessness. Instead of power, they are concerned with the powerless, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the vulnerable. Nietzsche's case was that Judaism and Christianity were an inversion of our natural instincts. They would never produce a society of strong, free human beings. But the evidence of history is that those civilizations that value right rather than might, that care for the vulnerable as much as for the strong, that defend the sanctity of human life and fight for the rights of the individuals, the civilizations that have a strong moral component are the ones that have flourished. No political system that denied these things has ever survived for long. The Third Reich was going to last for 1,000 years. It survived for 12. Communism was going to flourish to the end of history. It lasted effectively for 70 years. But Jewry, which was always been a relatively tiny people, and Christianity, which in its early period was a tiny sect, have both survived. Christianity for 2,000 years, Judaism for 4,000. Meanwhile, the great empires that all seemed invincible, Egypt, Syria, Babylon, Persia, ancient Greece, Rome, all the way through to Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, all have crumbled and fallen. Why? My answer is simple. If a society has no righteous moral component, then it is destroyed, usually from within. It implodes. Where there is a lack of character, civilizations wither and die. This doesn't happen overnight, but it happens. Western civilization today is increasingly all about political power and economic growth, the physical and conceptual components. And the result is a lack of understanding of who we are and what we stand for. In his book, Collins also tells the story of how he was out running with his wife one day and thinking how wonderfully fit she was. 12 weeks later, she had a double mastectomy. Behind an apparent picture of health, a malignant cancer had been growing. The brutal reality that as an individual person or a business or a nation can be the perfect picture of health and strength on the outside, but very sick on the inside. Colin's wife, I'm delighted to say, survived. But great companies, great nations, great civilization that look fit and invincible from the outside crash and burn. Great on the outside, but sick on the inside, they crumble and fall over time. There is a cancer at the heart of our society. It's not a cancer of immorality. There's always been immorality. Our cancer reflects the growth of a word that was used earlier today. It's a cancer of amorality, a belief that anything goes. A society where there is no right or wrong, where every view is equally valid, equally valuable. Amorality is an absence of or disregard for or indifference towards collective and individual morality. Cancers are, of course, very difficult to detect early. But if the brutal symptoms are recognized and faced up to, they can be relatively easy to cure. Conversely, they are easy to detect late on, but very difficult, maybe even impossible, to cure. Our malignant cancer has been growing for a long time, and we have failed collectively to recognize and deal with it, failed to keep a clear distinction between what we stand for and how we do things, failed to hold firm to enduring principles. Nowhere is it clearer that we have compromised our core values in our current attitude to the nature, the value, and sanctity of human life. Child sacrifice, the ritualistic killing of children, ended in Europe as a result of the spread of Christianity. It was only with the great Christian legal code enacted by the Emperor Justinian that such killing became a criminal offense. Sacrificing babies and children to Baal and other false gods to please or appease them was rife before then. The deliberate killing of around 300,000 unborn babies a year in the United Kingdom is not a sign of a moral or healthy society. A society that approves and applauds the sacrifice of the unborn to the gods of selfishness and convenience, both up to birth and potentially even beyond birth, with people talking about post-birth abortion, is a society that has lost sight of just how precious and sacred life is, as it has in a preparedness, as we've heard again discussed today, to legislate for assisted suicide, not just for the elderly, but as we've seen elsewhere in the West, for anyone, old or young enough, who can be persuaded to die for any number of reasons. As a wonderful, wonderful lady stricken with MS once told me, there were many days when she didn't want to live, but that wasn't the same as saying that she wanted to die. It's difficult to conclude anything other than all of this is evil. It is sin. It is wrong. And we need to see it in that light. We need to face up to these and other realities. We need to re-establish a moral component in our nation, in our society. Over many years, politicians have spoken about the need for a moral compass, but have failed to acknowledge that a moral compass springs from the soil from which all of our moral goods spring. This isn't about a rule book from which we draw easy answers to our problems. There is no clever technique that will achieve this. No act of parliament will make it right. We can pour billions into the problem, but it will make no difference. You can't legislate or buy a moral component. It must be owned and deeply embedded in our hearts and in our minds. I need to finish. The title of my talk was about being a Christian in conflict. As a Christian in the military, I was constantly engaged in conflict, and although I left 18 years ago, I remain engaged, if in a different sort of conflict. This one is essentially spiritual, and it is one in which we are all engaged. We must be under no illusion about this. To bring about change will take morally courageous leadership, standing firm against the tide, stemming from character built on biblical truth. And the time to start bringing about that change is now. 88 of the Psalms have to do with engaging with the enemy. Psalm 144, for example, says, "Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trained my hand for war and my fingers for battle." There are enemies out there. We need to get out of the trenches, stand up, advance, and confront them. Sun Tzu said around 2,500 years ago, "The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country," to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom. Now, I don't claim to be a jewel, but as someone once said, it isn't the general who wins the war, but the soldiers who fight it. The best general is the one who makes the soldiers want to fight, the moral component. That's been my aim today. Together we must protect our country and do good service for our sovereign, Jesus Christ. So I can but encourage you all to go out as a pilgrim and seek out danger. Pit your very souls against the unknown and seek stimulation in the company of the brave. And may God help us all as we try to do that. Thank you.